Once upon a time, on a gorgeous spring day when all the flowers were in bloom, my very small daughter came running into the kitchen asking me for a da. I had no idea what a da might be, so I asked her to please repeat, but every time she said the word, it was still clearly da. Thinking I was being clever, I asked her to tell me what a da was used for. It's for things, she said. What things, I asked. Many things, she answered, growing a little frustrated. So I tried another approach. What color is it? With tears welling up in her eyes, she wailed, it has no color. It took a while, but eventually I figured out that she wanted a jar so that she could pick me a bouquet of flowers. A jar, and I was asking her what color it was. Some things are hard to explain, especially when the questions being asked are not the right ones. Sometimes there aren't adequate words to explain a thing, or there may be, but the words aren't being heard the way they're meant. That's the premise of our story today, which is Jesus' famous encounter with Nicodemus, a learned man who knew pretty much all there was to know about his faith tradition, or he thought he did, until a new teacher named Jesus showed up in town and started doing things that defied explanation. Nicodemus sought Jesus out and asked him to explain himself, but their conversation was about as simple as describing the color of a jar. This is how it went according to the gospel we call John. Now there was a Pharisee named Nicodemus, a leader of the Jews. He came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do apart from the presence of God. Jesus answered him, very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above. Nicodemus said to him, how can anyone be born after having grown old? Can one enter a second time into the mother's womb and be born? Jesus answered, very truly, I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God without being born of water and spirit. What is born of the flesh is flesh, and what is born of the spirit is spirit. Do not be astonished that I said to you, you must be born from above. The wind blows where it chooses, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. Nicodemus said to him, how can these things be? Jesus answered him, are you a teacher of Israel, and yet you do not understand these things? Well, if this sounds a bit complicated in English, it was more confusing even in Greek, because the word for wind and spirit is the same word, pneumos. Poor Nicodemus was listening to Jesus talk about being born of the Spirit, or maybe wind, and this spirit, or maybe wind, blows where it chooses, and you don't know where the spirit wind comes from or where it goes. And so it is with everyone born of the Spirit wind. Maybe Nicodemus is not to be judged too harshly for not understanding these things. I think many of us struggle to understand these things. Like Nicodemus, we might be wondering, what does all that talk of spirit really mean anyway? It's a good question. What is this thing called spirit? Describing what the spirit is kind of like trying to describe the color of a jar. It's not so much tell me what it is as tell me what it does. We can do that. Just last week we heard the story of the Pentecost, when the Spirit filled a large group of people with the ability to communicate with each other across the usual boundaries of language. Very cool. In that case, spirit was described as something like a powerful wind. That's a metaphor, of course, but a useful one. Consider the properties of wind. You can't see it, but you can see evidence of it. Kites dancing, branches swaying, hair blowing. Wind is an energetic force that causes other things to move in ways they could not move on their own. And so it was with the Spirit that day of the Pentecost, moving some people to speak and others to understand in new and exciting ways. On that day, we say, the thing we call the church was born, ecclesia in Greek, but ecclesia does not refer to a church building. Ecclesia means a group of people unified by a common purpose. So you could say that a group of people filled with the Spirit was born that day. That means together they were born of the Spirit. I wonder if our friend Nicodemus was among them and if he understood then what Jesus had been telling him. I'd like to imagine that Nicodemus was there, filled with the Spirit of God and inspired to live his life in a new way, the way Jesus showed his followers to live. And the reason Jesus himself was able to live the way he did, that was thanks to the Spirit. We may remember that when Jesus was baptized, the Spirit descended upon him, and it immediately drove him out into the wilderness where he did a lot of soul searching about his purpose in life. And when he returned, he was a new man. It's almost like that carpenter from Nazareth had drowned in the river and a new person had been born in his place, someone who would dedicate the rest of his life to teaching people how to build a community that was life-giving to all. He was reborn that day, born of the Spirit, a changed person who would change the world. Without the Spirit, Jesus of Nazareth would have been just another Nazarene handyman. But instead of returning to the workshop, he went to the synagogue, announcing that the Spirit of God was in him, moving him to teach communities how to bring about healing and wholeness for those who experienced suffering. And those who found his mission inspiring became his followers, even if, like Nicodemus, they were still a little confused about the whole Spirit thing. But they learned by watching Jesus, and after he left, he sent the Spirit to help them, and they were given the gifts they needed to continue Jesus' work. Now, mostly that meant sharing their resources so that everyone had enough to eat, as the old spirit of selfishness gave way to a new spirit of generosity. The early church was not known for its tall steeples, but for its long tables and the miracles. Some of the stories of the early Jesus followers are quite astonishing and include miraculous works like healing and even resurrection. Reading these stories today, we might wonder, has the wind of the Spirit stopped blowing, or do we just not feel it the same way? For example, I personally have never resurrected a single person, and if you come to me complaining of headache, I will advise you to drink more water and maybe take some ibuprofen. Are we missing something? I don't pretend to know how the gifts of the Spirit are distributed the way they are or why. But as someone steeped in the practical theology of John Wesley, founder of Methodism, I tend to agree with him that the gifts of the Spirit we receive are in accordance with the needs of our time. And in the 21st century, that's ours, right? People like me don't need to heal the sick. The Spirit has given those gifts to the medical community. As for speaking in tongues, why? When there are translations of the Jesus story in nearly any language spoken on earth. The Spirit has given us the gifts we need. And even if they're not as exotic as miracle healing and tongues, I'd say they are just as useful. Understanding, teaching, praying, encouraging, speaking up on behalf of the disempowered, those are marvelous gifts. But having the gift is only the beginning. The other part, you see, is using the gift. And this we learn from Jesus' own story. When he was first filled with the Spirit at his baptism, we remember that he went into the wilderness to think about what he was going to do with his gifts. He understood that he could be tempted to use them solely for his own benefit or for the benefit of others. Or he could have been tempted to not use them at all, realizing that his particular gifts were going to draw a lot of attention and get him into trouble, which of course they did. But ultimately, he chose to be led by the Spirit, using his gifts to offer as much blessing to as many as possible. And when it was time for his ministry to end, he promised that his followers would in time receive the same Spirit that had activated his gifts, and it did. And it still does. We too have the Spirit of God within us, giving us all the gifts we need to participate in God's ongoing work in the world. Will we let that Spirit flourish, letting it give birth to something new and wonderful in us and through us? If so, then we have our answer to the Nicodemus question, what is the Spirit thing all about anyway? It is about letting the Spirit guide us where it will, opening our hearts to feeling God's call in our life, and recognizing the gifts we have been given to answer that call. When we do this, a beautiful thing happens. We bear the fruit of the Spirit. Over the summer, after I return from a few travel obligations, and about the time our actual fruit trees will be starting to bear fruit, we will start a series of lessons to learn about the fruits of the Spirit. My hope is that thinking about the fruit we want to bear will help us to grow as a spirit-filled people of faith, cultivating our spiritual fruits with intentionality. But for now, let us recognize that each fruit of the Spirit is flowering in us in the form of the gifts we have been given. Whatever your gift is, it is beautiful. And when put together with the other gifts present in our community, what a lovely bouquet of spiritual flowers they will make. All we need is a da to hold them. Just don't ask me what color it is.